November 18, 1943. Chartwell Manor's wine cellar. Edward Hartwell held his breath as the 12th German Commando crawled past his hiding spot, clutching a leather dispatch case. The boy, he couldn't have been 20, was bleeding from his shoulder, whispering prayers in German. Edward had a clear shot. His orders were absolute, no survivors. He watched the Nazi disappear into the November fog. That single moment of mercy haunted 30 years. The commando Edward spared became a ghost, vanishing into post-war chaos. Until 3 days ago, when Edward found an envelope on his doorstep. Inside, a photograph of himself from that night, taken by someone who'd been watching, someone who knew. The boy he saved had never forgotten the British officer who let him live. And now, after 3 decades of silence, he wanted to collect on that debt. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. The package arrived on a Tuesday morning, unremarkable as autumn rain against the windows of the Churchill war rooms. Marcus Whitfield had been sorting through visitor feedback forms when the intern knocked, nervous, apologetic, clutching a brown parcel that had somehow bypassed the museum's security protocols. "Sorry, Colonel. This came through the main entrance. No return address, but it's marked personal and confidential for you." Marcus took the package with steady hands, though something cold settled in his chest. In 30 years as head of security, personal mail never reached his office. Everything was screened, logged, processed through proper channels. He dismissed the intern with a nod and locked his office door. The package was heavier than it should have been. Plain brown paper, tied with string. His name written in block capitals across the front. Not printed, but carefully hand-lettered in black ink. The kind of deliberate penmanship they'd taught in schools before the war. Marcus set it on his desk and stared at it for a full minute. Somewhere beneath the London streets, tourists were walking through the cabinet war rooms, marveling at Churchill's cigar-stained maps and the bed where the Prime Minister had slept during the Blitz. They had no idea they were treading above rooms that didn't appear on any museum floor plan. Rooms where 12 men had died on a November night that officially never happened. He cut the string with his letter opener. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a photograph. Black and white, grainy with age. It showed a young man in British Army uniform standing beside Churchill himself in what looked like the map room downstairs. The young man was smiling, cocky, confident, unaware that in 6 hours he would be holding a smoking pistol and wondering if he'd just saved Britain or damned his soul. The young man was Marcus. His hands began to shake as he unwrapped the second item. A Nazi SS dagger, its silver blade tarnished but still sharp. Dark stains marred the metal near the hilt. Stains he remembered making 30 years ago when the world had gone mad in those underground tunnels. But it was the third item that stopped his breath entirely. A single sheet of paper, typed on what looked like an old manual typewriter. The message was brief. Colonel Whitfield, you killed 11 men on November 23, 1943. The War Office called them enemy agents. You believed you were protecting Churchill and Britain itself. But you never asked why those men were carrying British intelligence files. You never wondered why they knew the bunker's layout better than the Nazi High Command ever could. They weren't German spies, Marcus. They were British agents, Churchill's own men, and I was supposed to be the 12th. 30 years I've waited to tell you this story. 30 years I've carried the weight of watching you execute my brothers in arms while believing yourself a hero. The war is over, Colonel, but our business is not. Check tomorrow's Times obituary section. Look for a familiar name. Then we'll talk. A ghost from November. Marcus read the letter 3 times before his mind could process the words. His office felt suddenly airless, the familiar sounds of the museum above fading to white noise, tourists laughing, children asking questions about the war, all of it meaningless against the thunderous silence of his own heartbeat. He reached for his desk phone, then stopped. Who could he call? The War Office had sealed those files under the Official Secrets Act. Churchill was long dead. The only other witnesses to that night were buried in unmarked graves in places that didn't exist on any map, or so he'd believed. Marcus stood and walked to his window, looking out at the gray November afternoon. London bustled past, taxis, pedestrians, the eternal rhythm of a city that had survived the Blitz and everything since. None of them knew that somewhere among them walked a man who'd spent 3 decades planning this moment. He thought about that night in 1943, the way Churchill had gripped his shoulder afterward, eyes heavy with something Marcus had taken for gratitude. What happened here tonight never happened, Colonel. Do you understand? For the good of Britain. Marcus had nodded, proud to carry such a burden for his country. Now, staring at the photograph of his younger self, he wondered what Churchill had really meant. What secrets lay buried beneath the official version of events? And how many more lies would surface before this ghost from November was finished with him? The museum would close in 3 hours. Tourists would file out, guides would lock the doors, and Marcus would be alone with the weight of 30 years of carefully constructed silence. He picked up the SS dagger, feeling its familiar weight in his palm. Somewhere in London, someone was waiting for him to make the next move. Someone who claimed to know the truth about November 23, 1943. Someone who'd been watching him all these years, biding their time. Marcus Whitfield had thought that night was over. He was about to learn it had only just begun. Introduction. The SS dagger felt heavier than memory served. Marcus turned it slowly in the lamplight, watching shadows dance across the tarnished silver blade. The weight distribution was wrong. Too much mass in the handle, the balance point shifted toward the pommel. Either 3 decades had changed his grip, or this wasn't the same weapon he'd taken from a dying man's hand in 1943. A soft knock interrupted his examination. "Colonel?" Sarah's voice carried the careful concern of someone who'd worked beside him for 8 years. Sarah Chen, his deputy head of security, possessed an unsettling ability to read his moods. Former Metropolitan Police, sharp enough to notice when something was off but diplomatic enough not to press. Usually. "Come in." She entered carrying 2 cups of tea, Earl Grey the way he preferred it, strong enough to wake the dead, with just enough milk to take the edge off. The small ritual had become their afternoon routine, a quiet moment stolen between tourist groups and administrative duties. "You missed the 3 o'clock briefing," she said, setting his cup on the desk. Her eyes found the photograph before he could slide it beneath a file folder. "Everything all right?" "Just sorting through some old correspondence." Marcus slipped the dagger into his desk drawer, but not before Sarah's trained gaze catalogued its presence. Nothing urgent. She settled into the chair across from his desk, cradling her tea. At 42, Sarah possessed the kind of contained energy that made Marcus think of a coiled spring. Her black hair was pulled back in its usual precise bun, not a strand out of place despite spending the morning dealing with a suspicious package scare, false alarm, thankfully, and a group of schoolchildren who'd somehow managed to trigger 3 separate security alerts. The Morrison family called again, she said, about the anniversary memorial service next week. Marcus nodded, though his attention remained fractured. The Morrisons had lost their grandfather in the London bombings, wanted to hold a small ceremony in the map room. Standard request, routine approval process. The kind of thing that usually warranted his full consideration. Families deserved reverence for their losses. Today, the weight of his own secrets made their grief feel impossibly distant. "Approve it," he said, "but limit the group to 12 people." "Already done." "Colonel," Sarah's voice carried a note he'd learned to recognize. "Are you certain everything's all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." The phrase hit closer to home than she could know. Marcus forced a smile, lifting his teacup to buy time. The familiar ritual, Earl Grey, bone china, the gentle clink of spoon against saucer, usually centered him. Today it felt like theater. "Just tired," he said. "It's been a long week." Through his office window, London's afternoon light was fading into the gray November dusk that made this city feel haunted even on ordinary days. Streetlights flickered to life along King Charles Street, and pedestrians hurried past with collars turned up against the autumn chill. Normal people living normal lives, unburdened by the weight of wartime secrets. Sarah followed his gaze. "Remember when I first started here? You told me this place holds more secrets than any museum should." "Did I?" He couldn't recall the conversation, though it sounded like something he might have said during her orientation. Sarah had arrived fresh from the Met's Art and Antiquities unit. eager to apply her investigative skills to museum security. 8 years later, she'd become indispensable and dangerous in her way. She noticed things, made connections, asked questions that carved too close to buried truths. You said the hardest part of this job wasn't protecting the exhibits from visitors. It was protecting visitors from what the exhibits really meant. Sarah set down her cup, studying him with those sharp brown eyes. Some days I think you know more about what happened down here during the war than any of the official histories contain. Marcus felt the phantom weight of the dagger in his desk drawer. Somewhere in London, a ghost from November was reading tomorrow's obituaries and planning their next move. Somewhere above them, tourists walked through sanitized history, admiring Churchill's resolve without understanding the prices that resolve demanded. And here, in this small office suspended between public memory and private truth, sat the only person in his life who might notice when that past finally came calling. Sarah represented everything he stood to lose. Not romantically. Their relationship remained professionally proper, a careful friendship built on mutual respect and shared dedication to their work. But she'd become his anchor to the present, proof that Marcus Whitfield was more than the sum of one terrible night's decisions. If his ghost from November wanted to destroy him, Sarah would be collateral damage. Her career, her reputation, her faith in the institution they both served, all of it would crumble when the truth surfaced. The past has a way of reshaping itself, Marcus said finally. What we remember isn't always what actually happened, but what actually happened is still there, Sarah replied, waiting beneath the surface. Outside, London's evening rush began in earnest. Soon the museum would close, visitors would depart, and Marcus would be alone with his ghosts. Marcus watched Sarah finish her tea, each sip a reminder of normalcy about to shatter. The familiar routine of their afternoon conversations, her updates on security protocols, his measured responses, the comfortable silence of two professionals who'd learned to work in harmony, all of it felt fragile now, like crystal balanced on a shelf during an earthquake. I should let you get back to work, Sarah said, rising from her chair. She paused at the door, hand on the handle. Colonel, promise me something. If whatever's troubling you becomes something that affects the museum's security, you'll tell me. That's what I'm here for. Marcus nodded, though the lie sat heavy in his throat. Of course. The door closed with a soft click, leaving him alone with the weight of secrets and the phantom presence of the dagger in his drawer. He opened it again, studying the weapon that had apparently traveled 30 years to find its way back to him. The blade caught the lamplight, revealing scratches he didn't remember making. His secure phone rang. The red telephone on his desk was connected to a direct line used only for emergencies. Bomb threats, security breaches, incidents requiring immediate coordination with Scotland Yard or MI5. In 8 years, Sarah had seen him answer it perhaps a dozen times. It never rang after hours unless London itself was in danger. Marcus stared at the device through 3 rings, his hand frozen above the receiver. Only 5 people had this number. Sarah was one. His contact at the Metropolitan Police was another. The remaining 3 were civil servants so senior their names appeared on no public rosters. None of them should be calling at 5:30 on a Tuesday evening. The 4th ring echoed in his small office like a gunshot. Whitfield. Hello, Marcus. The voice was cultured, educated, carrying the faint trace of an accent he couldn't place. Not German. He would have recognized that immediately. Something else. Something that made his skin crawl with recognition he couldn't name. You received my package. Marcus's grip tightened on the receiver. Through his window, London's evening traffic flowed past in ordinary patterns. Black cabs, red buses, pedestrians heading home to families who had no idea their city's most carefully guarded museum was hosting a conversation that should have been impossible. Who is this? I told you. A ghost from November. A pause, filled with the sound of London traffic on the caller's end. Close. Whoever this was, they were nearby. Did you look at the photograph, Marcus? Really look at it? Marcus's free hand found the black and white image on his desk. His younger self stood beside Churchill in the map room, both men smiling for what appeared to be an official portrait. But now, studying it more carefully, he noticed details that chilled him. The timestamp in the corner read November 22, 1943. one day before the mission that had haunted him for 3 decades, and in the background, barely visible in the shadows, stood a figure he hadn't noticed before. A young man in civilian clothes, watching the camera with an expression Marcus couldn't read. "You're beginning to understand," the voice continued. "That photograph was taken during the briefing. The real briefing, Marcus. The one where Churchill explained what was really going to happen that night." "You're lying." But even as Marcus spoke, memories began shifting, reshaping themselves like figures in fog. Details he'd forgotten, or perhaps chosen not to remember. The way Churchill had dismissed his usual security detail that evening, the sealed orders that Marcus was told to open only after the mission began, the strange calm in Churchill's voice when he'd said, "Some sacrifices are necessary for the greater good." The 12 men who came through those tunnels weren't German agents, the voice said softly. They were British intelligence operatives who discovered something they shouldn't have. Something about Churchill's plans for D-Day. Something that would have compromised everything. Marcus closed his eyes, but the memories were surfacing now, unstoppable as floodwater through a broken dam. The way the supposed German infiltrators had moved through the bunker with impossible knowledge of its layout, the recognition in their eyes when they'd seen him, not surprise at encountering resistance, but betrayal at seeing a familiar face. The British intelligence files they'd carried, documents he'd been ordered to burn without reading. "So you used me," Marcus whispered. "Churchill used you. I was supposed to be the 13th man down there, Marcus, the one who would ensure none of the others survived to tell their story. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't watch you execute good men while believing yourself a patriot." The phone felt slick in Marcus's sweating palm. Outside his office, the museum settled into its evening quiet. Somewhere above, Sarah was probably conducting the final security sweep, checking locks, setting alarms, protecting a sanitized version of history that bore no resemblance to the truth rotting in this underground tomb. "What do you want?" "Justice. For the men who died that night. For the truth Churchill buried with them." The voice carried weight now, 30 years of accumulated rage given form. "Check tomorrow's obituary section, Marcus. Look for Edward Morrison, 87 years old. Survived the London Blitz, devoted grandfather, pillar of his community. Morrison." Marcus's blood turned to ice water. "The memorial service. Edward Morrison was one of the 12 men you killed that night. His family has no idea he spent the war in British intelligence. They believe he died in an air raid, because that's what Churchill's people told them. They've been grieving a lie for 3 decades, Marcus. And tomorrow they'll hold their memorial service in the very room where you put a bullet in their grandfather's head." The line went dead. The silence that followed stretched like a held breath. Marcus set the receiver down with deliberate care, his hand trembling despite 30 years of practiced control. The red phone had never felt more like an instrument of judgment. Morrison. The name echoed in his mind as he reached for the morning's Times, still folded on his desk beneath a stack of requisition forms. His fingers fumbled through the pages until he found the obituary section. There, in neat black type, was a photograph of an elderly man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Edward Morrison, 87, passed peacefully surrounded by family. Devoted husband, grandfather, and pillar of the Hampstead community. During the war, Edward served his country with distinction, though he rarely spoke of those difficult years. He will be remembered for his kindness, his love of cricket, and his unwavering belief that good men could triumph over darkness. Memorial service to be held November 28th at the Churchill War Rooms, Map Room. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to the Imperial War Museum. Marcus's coffee went cold as he stared at the photograph. The face was older, softer, marked by decades of what appeared to be a peaceful life. But the eyes, those eyes belonged to the young man who had looked at Marcus with such betrayal in the moments before dying. The man who had whispered, "Tell them the truth," with his last breath. A knock at his door made him start. "Come in." Sarah entered without her usual evening efficiency. Her movements were careful, controlled, the way she moved when something was wrong. "Colonel, we need to talk." "What is it?" "I've been reviewing the security logs from this afternoon. The delivery van that brought your package, it doesn't exist." She placed a folder on his desk, her expression grim. The license plate belongs to a vehicle that was scrapped in 1987. The delivery company has no record of any package sent here today. And the driver. She opened the folder to reveal a grainy CCTV image. The driver paid cash and gave a false name. Marcus studied the photograph. The image was poor quality, taken from above, but something about the figure made his breath catch. Medium height, careful posture, face turned away from the camera with the precision of someone who understood surveillance. "There's more," Sarah continued. "I ran the partial fingerprints we lifted from the package wrapping. They're not in any current database, but they match prints found at 3 other locations in London over the past month. All places connected to wartime intelligence records." "What kind of places?" "The National Archives, the Cabinet Office, the old War Office building." Sarah's voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent years investigating patterns others missed. Someone's been researching Churchill's wartime operations, specifically classified operations that most people don't know existed. Marcus felt the walls of his carefully constructed life beginning to crumble. For 30 years, he'd believed the secret of November 23rd was buried with Churchill and the Official Secrets Act. Now Sarah stood before him with evidence that someone had been methodically unearthing that past. "Sarah, I need you to do something for me." His voice came out steadier than he felt. "Cancel the Morrison Memorial Service." "Sir?" "Or find a reason. Maintenance issues, security concerns, anything. That family cannot hold their service here." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Colonel, what's going on? You've been acting strangely all afternoon, and now you want me to cancel a memorial service we already approved. These people are grieving. They've planned—" "I know what they've planned." Marcus stood, moving to his window. London's evening traffic moved in familiar patterns below, but nothing felt familiar anymore, and I know why someone wants them here. "Who wants them here?" Marcus turned back to find Sarah watching him with the expression she wore when pieces of a puzzle were falling into place. It was the look that had made her so valuable as an investigator, and so dangerous as a colleague who might ask the wrong questions. "There are things about this place," Marcus began, then stopped. How could he explain 30 years of lies without destroying everything she believed about their work? About him? Sarah closed the folder and placed it carefully on his desk. "Colonel Whitfield, in 8 years of working together, you've never lied to me. Please don't start now." The weight of her trust felt heavier than the dagger in his drawer. Outside, the last tourists were being shepherded toward the exits. Soon the museum would be empty except for the ghosts that Marcus had thought were safely buried. "I can't tell you what you want to know," he said finally. "But I can tell you this. Someone is using the Morrison family to get to me. And if they succeed, everything we've worked to protect here will be destroyed." Sarah studied his face for a long moment. "Then we stop them." "This isn't your fight, Sarah." "It became my fight the moment they threatened this place." Her voice carried the quiet steel that had made her one of the Met's best investigators. "Besides, you said it yourself. Some secrets are worth protecting." Marcus almost smiled at that. If only she knew how wrong he'd been about which secrets deserved protection. Marcus watched the resolve in Sarah's eyes and felt something cold settle in his chest. Her faith in him, in their shared mission, would become another casualty when the truth emerged. He'd spent 30 years protecting the wrong secret, and now the woman who trusted him most was volunteering to help him perpetuate that lie. "Sarah, listen to me very carefully." He moved back to his desk, pulled out the drawer, and withdrew the SS dagger. Her sharp intake of breath echoed in the small office. "This arrived with the photograph. It's evidence from a night I've spent 3 decades trying to forget." She stepped closer, her investigative instincts overriding caution. "Oh my God, is that blood?" "Yes." The word came out like a confession. 30-year-old blood from men who died believing they were serving their country. The color drained from Sarah's face as she studied the weapon. Marcus had seen that expression before, the moment when a detective realized their case wasn't what they'd thought. "Colonel, what happened down here during the war?" Before Marcus could answer, the secure phone rang again. The red light blinked like an accusation in the gathering dusk. Sarah's eyes flicked between Marcus and the phone, understanding beginning to dawn in her expression. "Don't answer it," she said quietly. But Marcus was already reaching for the receiver. Some conversations couldn't be postponed. Whitfield. You told someone. The voice carried disappointment now, almost paternal. I hoped you'd learned better judgment over the years, Marcus. But you're still making the same mistakes that got 12 good men killed. Sarah was close enough to hear both sides of the conversation. Marcus watched her face change as the implications hit her. The photograph, the dagger, the impossible phone call from someone who shouldn't exist. The Morrison family is already on their way to London, the voice continued. Edward's granddaughter drove up from Brighton this afternoon. His son flew in from Edinburgh. They're staying at the Dorchester, room 412 if you'd like to verify. Sweet family. They truly believe their grandfather died heroically in the Blitz. Marcus gripped the phone tighter. Leave them out of this. I didn't drag them into it, Marcus. You did, the night you pulled that trigger. Every lie Churchill told their family traces back to your finger on that dagger. A pause filled with London traffic and the weight of accumulated years. But you could still tell them the truth. Imagine their faces when they learned their beloved grandfather died not defending London from Nazis, but trying to prevent Churchill from sacrificing British agents for strategic advantage. Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm, her eyes wide with horror. She'd put enough pieces together to understand the shape of what they were facing, even if the full picture remained hidden. What do you want? Marcus asked. Tomorrow evening, after the memorial service begins, you'll escort the Morrison family to the map room's archives. You'll show them the classified files hidden in Churchill's personal safe, the ones that detail exactly what their grandfather discovered about Operation Bodyguard, the ones that explain why 12 loyal British intelligence officers had to die to protect Churchill's deception. Marcus felt his carefully constructed world finally collapse. The files the voice referenced weren't supposed to exist anymore. They'd been classified beyond any normal security protocol, hidden even from official histories. The fact that someone knew about them meant they'd penetrated security layers that should have been impenetrable. Those files were destroyed, Marcus said, though his voice carried no conviction. Churchill never destroyed anything, Marcus. He just hid it very, very well. Check the false panel behind his portrait in the map room. The combination is November 2343. You'll find everything there. The real operational orders, the lists of British agents marked for elimination, the correspondence with Stalin about acceptable losses. Sarah's grip on Marcus's arm tightened. She was hearing evidence of a conspiracy that rewrote everything they thought they knew about Churchill's war leadership. Marcus could see her mind working, connections forming, the detective in her building a case that would destroy not just his life, but the entire foundation of British wartime mythology. If I do this, Marcus said slowly, if I show them those files, what happens then? Then the Morrison family learns why their grandfather really died. Then the world learns what Churchill was willing to sacrifice for victory. And then, Marcus, you finally get to stop carrying this burden alone. The line went dead again, leaving Marcus and Sarah staring at each other in the gathering darkness. Outside, London carried on its evening routine, unaware that in a small office beneath Whitehall, two people sat with evidence that could rewrite history. Colonel, Sarah whispered, please tell me you weren't part of whatever this is about. Marcus looked at her earnest face, her professional concern, her complete faith that he would give her an answer that made sense of everything. He thought about the Morrison family, probably having dinner at the Dorchester, planning their memorial service with love and pride for a grandfather whose real story would destroy their peace forever. I wish I could, he said finally. Sarah's face went through a series of emotions, confusion, disbelief, and finally, the cold professionalism of someone who just realized they were sitting across from a suspect rather than a colleague. You were part of it, she said, her voice flat. Whatever happened that night, you were there. Marcus nodded slowly. I was the weapon Churchill used to clean up his mess. You've been lying to me for 8 years. Sarah stepped back from his desk, her hand unconsciously moving toward her phone. Every tour I've given, every story I've told about Churchill's courage and sacrifice, those weren't lies, Sarah. Churchill was everything we've said he was. He was also something else entirely. The secure phone rang again. This time, Sarah moved toward it, but Marcus caught her wrist. Don't let me go, Colonel. The title carried no respect now, only the careful distance of someone reassessing everything she thought she knew. Marcus released her hand and answered the phone himself. "You're disappointing me, Marcus." The voice carried a familiar tone that suddenly struck him like a physical blow. Not familiar from their recent conversations, but from decades past. From a briefing room 30 years ago, where a young aide had stood in the shadows, taking notes while Churchill outlined the operation that would destroy 12 lives. "I know who you are," Marcus whispered. Sarah froze, watching his face transform as recognition hit. "Do you, Marcus? Do you really?" The voice shifted slightly, dropping an accent that had been carefully maintained. What remained was pure Oxford English, educated and precise. "Think carefully. Who was in that briefing room when Churchill explained the real mission? Who took the minutes that were never filed? Who watched you walk away that night believing you'd served your country?" The photograph on Marcus's desk seemed to blur as memories resharpened themselves with perfect, terrible clarity. The figure in the background wasn't a stranger at all. It was Churchill's personal secretary, a earnest young man who'd been present at every briefing, privy to every secret, trusted with information that could reshape the war. "Jonathan Hartwell," Marcus breathed. "Very good. Though I haven't used that name in quite some time." Sarah's eyes widened. She'd spent years studying the museum's history. She knew that Jonathan Hartwell had been Churchill's most trusted aide during the critical period of 1943, the man who'd helped coordinate the elaborate deceptions that would eventually ensure D-Day's success. "But you died," Marcus said. "Official records show you were killed in an air raid in December 1943. The same convenient air raid that claimed Edward Morrison and 11 other inconvenient truths." The voice carried bitter amusement now. Churchill was very thorough about tying up loose ends. He just never imagined that one of his loose ends might have friends in the right places. Marcus felt the last pillars of his understanding collapse. "You faked your own death. I had help. There were others who began to suspect what Churchill was really doing. People who realized that winning the war was becoming more important to him than preserving the men fighting it. They helped me disappear before I became the next sacrifice to strategic necessity." Sarah was staring at Marcus with growing horror. "Colonel, who was Edward Morrison? What really happened that night?" Marcus looked at her, then at the photograph, then at the blood-stained dagger. 30 years of carefully constructed justification crumbled like ancient parchment. "Edward Morrison was a British intelligence officer investigating Operation Bodyguard," he said slowly. "He discovered that Churchill was deliberately feeding false information to German spies, but also to our own agents, men who were being sacrificed to make the deception more convincing." "My God," Sarah whispered. "Morrison and 11 other intelligence officers came to the bunker that night to confront Churchill with evidence of what he was doing. I was told they were German infiltrators. I was told they were carrying plans that would compromise D-Day." Marcus's voice grew hollow. "I believed it because Churchill needed me to believe it." The phone crackled. "Tell her the rest, Marcus." "The rest? Tell her whose grandson I am." The words hit Marcus like a sledgehammer to the chest. He stared at the photograph again, seeing not just the young aide in the background, but the familiar jawline, the set of the shoulders, the way he held his head when concentrating. "No," Marcus breathed. "Winston Spencer Churchill was my grandfather, Marcus, and you helped him murder 12 British agents to protect a lie that I've spent 30 years learning to live with." Sarah's coffee cup slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering on the floor between them. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. "You arrogant bastard," Jonathan continued, his voice thick with decades of suppressed rage. "You thought you were protecting Britain's greatest hero. You never once considered that maybe, just maybe, the hero was capable of being a monster." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Marcus stared at the shattered coffee cup, its fragments catching the lamplight like accusations scattered across his office floor. 30 years of certainty lay broken with the porcelain. "Churchill's grandson," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. She backed against the door, her detective's mind racing through implications that threatened to topple everything she'd believed about the war, about heroism, about the man she'd worked beside for 8 years. "You helped murder 12 British agents on the orders of Churchill's own family." Not family, Marcus said hoarsely. Churchill didn't know. Jonathan was just his aide, his secretary. He took notes, he observed, Marcus stopped, the full horror of it washing over him. He watched. All those years he watched his own grandfather become something monstrous. And then he watched me become the instrument of that monstrosity. The phone crackled again, Jonathan's voice cutting through their shock like a blade. Do you understand now, Marcus? You weren't protecting Britain that night. You were protecting one man's reputation at the cost of 12 others' lives. And you did it so efficiently, so completely, that you convinced yourself it was heroic. Marcus felt something breaking inside his chest, a structural collapse of everything he'd built his identity around. The Morrison family, tomorrow night, what are you going to do to them? I'm going to give them the truth their grandfather died trying to tell. Every detail, every classified file, every piece of evidence that shows how Churchill sacrificed his own people to maintain strategic advantage. Jonathan's voice grew softer, almost gentle. They deserve to know that Edward Morrison didn't die in some random bombing. He died because he discovered that his own government was using British agents as expendable props in an elaborate deception. Sarah moved closer to Marcus's desk, her training overriding her shock. The files you mentioned, the ones behind Churchill's portrait, if they exist, they're evidence of war crimes. We have to what, Sarah? Marcus turned to face her, and she stepped back at the devastation in his eyes. Reported to whom? The same government that classified the operation? The same system that spent 70 years celebrating Churchill as the savior of democracy? There are people who would listen. Historians, journalists. Who would destroy the reputation of the man who saved Britain from Nazi occupation? Marcus laughed bitterly. Do you think anyone wants to learn that their greatest wartime hero was willing to murder his own intelligence officers to protect an operation? Jonathan's voice cut through their argument. Tell her about the others, Marcus. Tell her about the men you killed that night. Marcus closed his eyes, but the memories came flooding back with perfect, merciless clarity. They weren't armed. They came to the bunker carrying documents, evidence of what Churchill was doing. They thought they were meeting with senior officials who would listen to their concerns. His voice dropped to a whisper. Instead, they met me. Sarah's face went pale. You killed unarmed men? I was told they were enemy agents. I was told they carried intelligence that would compromise the invasion. Churchill himself gave me the orders. Marcus opened his eyes, meeting her horrified gaze. I believed it because I wanted to believe it, because it made me a hero instead of a murderer. The office felt smaller now, the walls pressing in with the weight of confession. Sarah stood frozen between the door and Marcus's desk, between her duty as a police officer and her human inability to process what she was hearing. The Morrison family, Jonathan continued, they've planned a beautiful memorial service. Edward's granddaughter wrote a speech about his sacrifice for freedom. His son is bringing medals they've kept polished for 70 years. They're going to stand in the very room where you killed him and celebrate his heroism. Stop, Marcus whispered, unless you tell them the truth first. Sarah found her voice again. You can't let this happen. Those people, they're innocent. They don't deserve to have their family's memory destroyed for your revenge. My revenge? Jonathan's voice sharpened. Sarah, it is Sarah, isn't it? Let me ask you something. If you discovered that your grandfather had been murdered by his own government, and the man who killed him had spent 30 years being honored as a hero, what would you call justice? Sarah looked between the phone and Marcus, her professional instincts warring with human sympathy. I'd call it the past. I'd call it something that happened to people who are dead now, being inflicted on people who are alive and innocent. Innocent? Jonathan laughed, a sound like glass breaking. Marcus isn't innocent. He's been living a lie for 3 decades, collecting honors and respect for protecting secrets that should have destroyed him. And every day he doesn't tell the truth, he makes himself more guilty. Marcus reached for the dagger on his desk, his fingers tracing the dried blood on its blade. Tomorrow night the Morrison family would arrive at the museum carrying flowers and memories and love for a grandfather they'd never really known. And he would have to choose between protecting his own carefully constructed life and destroying theirs with the truth. What happens, Marcus asked quietly, If I refuse, then I tell them myself, Jonathan replied. But I'd rather they heard it from the man who looked their grandfather in the eye before he died. The line went dead, leaving Marcus and Sarah in a silence that felt heavier than the tons of concrete above their heads. Marcus set the phone down with deliberate precision, his movements careful and controlled, as if sudden motion might shatter what remained of his composure. 30 years, he said, staring at his hands. 30 years of telling myself I saved Britain. 30 years of believing I was a guardian of freedom. He looked up at Sarah, his eyes hollow. Do you know what the worst part is? I still remember their faces, every single one of them. Edward Morrison was the last to die, and he kept saying, please, just read the documents, just look at what we found. Even as His voice broke. Sarah stood frozen by the door, her detective's training warring with human revulsion. Colonel, you need to turn yourself in. There are procedures, ways to handle this that don't involve destroying innocent families. Procedures? Marcus rose from his chair, moving to the window that looked out onto St. James's Park. In the darkness, he could see couples walking hand in hand, tourists taking evening photographs, people living normal lives untouched by the weight of wartime secrets. Sarah, there are no procedures for this, no protocols for dismantling the mythology that an entire nation has built its identity around. But Jonathan, Churchill's grandson, he's right, isn't he? Those families deserve the truth. Marcus turned back to her, and Sarah saw something she'd never seen in 8 years of working together, complete defeat. Yes, he said quietly, he's absolutely right. And that's what terrifies me. Sarah moved closer, her hand hovering near her phone. We call the authorities. We do this properly. We destroy 12 families to satisfy one man's need for justice? Marcus shook his head. Jonathan has spent 3 decades planning this revenge. He's thought through every angle, every consequence. The Morrison family is just the beginning. Once he exposes what happened that night, every family of every man I killed will want answers. There will be investigations, revelations, trials. He gestured at the walls around them. This entire museum will become a testament to lies. The intercom on his desk crackled to life. Marcus and Sarah both froze as his night security chief's voice filled the room. Colonel Whitfield, sir? There's a gentleman here to see you. Says his name is Jonathan Hartwell, and that you're expecting him. Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm. He's here. He's actually here. Marcus looked at the dagger on his desk, then at Sarah's terrified face, then at the phone that had delivered 30 years of reckoning in a single conversation. Send him down, please. Sir? At this hour? Send him down. As the intercom clicked off, Sarah stepped between Marcus and the door. I won't let you hurt him. Whatever happened 30 years ago, whatever he's threatening to do, I won't let you solve this with more violence. Marcus smiled sadly. Sarah, look at me, really look. Do I seem like a man preparing for violence? She studied his face and realized he was right. The tension that had defined him for weeks was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. You're going to confess, she whispered. I'm going to do what I should have done 30 years ago. I'm going to tell the truth. Marcus moved to his safe, entering the combination with steady fingers. From inside, he withdrew a folder marked with classification stamps so restrictive Sarah had never seen their like. Churchill's real operational files. Every order, every authorization, every signature that turned 12 British intelligence officers into acceptable casualties. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Slow, measured, deliberate. The footsteps of a man who had waited 3 decades for this moment. When he comes through that door, Marcus said, holding the folder against his chest, you're going to see the face of a child who watched his grandfather become a monster and spent his entire adult life trying to decide whether justice was more important than legacy. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A gentle knock, almost polite. Come in, Marcus called. The door opened to reveal a man in his 70s, tall and distinguished, with Churchill's unmistakable jawline and eyes that held the accumulated weight of a lifetime's worth of terrible knowledge. He stepped into the office with the careful dignity of someone who had rehearsed this moment countless times in his imagination. "Hello, Marcus," Jonathan Hartwell said, his voice carrying the same Oxford precision it had held on the phone, but softer now, almost gentle. "You look older than I expected. So do you." Marcus held up the folder. "I suppose you want these." Jonathan's eyes fixed on the classified documents, and for the first time in their conversation, his composure cracked slightly. "I want the Morrison family to know their grandfather died a hero, just not the kind of hero they think." Sarah watched the two men face each other across 30 years of secrets, and realized she was witnessing the moment when the past finally, irrevocably, collided with the present. Marcus set the folder on his desk between them, his hands trembling slightly as he released documents that had waited 7 decades to see light. "Edward Morrison was trying to save Operation Bodyguard from my grandfather's extremism," Jonathan said, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime's careful research. He'd discovered that Winston wasn't just feeding false intelligence to German spies. He was sacrificing British agents to make the deception more credible. Sarah watched the two elderly men regard each other with something between hatred and understanding. The underground office felt like a confessional now, heavy with the gravity of admissions that could reshape history. "Your grandfather," Marcus said quietly, "stood in this very room and told me those 12 men were Nazi infiltrators. He looked me in the eye and said Britain's survival depended on stopping them." He touched the folder's edge. "I've read every document since, every authorization, every strategic memo. He knew exactly who they were." Jonathan nodded slowly. "Winston Churchill saved Britain from Nazi occupation. But he also murdered 12 of his own intelligence officers to protect an operation he'd grown obsessed with." He met Marcus's gaze directly. "You were 23 years old, hand-picked, loyal, eager to serve. The perfect weapon for an old man's terrible calculus. That doesn't excuse what I did." "No," Jonathan agreed, "but it explains it." They stood in silence, the museum's ventilation system humming around them like mechanical breathing. Sarah realized she was witnessing something unprecedented, not just confession, but a kind of mutual absolution between victim and perpetrator. "The Morrison family arrives tomorrow at 7, Jonathan said eventually. "Edward's granddaughter has prepared a speech about sacrifice and heroism. She's bringing her children, his great-grandchildren, to honor the grandfather they've been taught to revere." Marcus closed his eyes. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to tell them the truth. All of it. What really happened that night. Why their grandfather died. What he was trying to prevent." Jonathan's voice softened. "They deserve to know he died trying to save British lives, not sacrifice them." Sarah found herself speaking before she'd consciously decided to. "And after?" "When the story breaks, when the investigations begin, when Churchill's reputation crumbles, what then?" Jonathan turned to her with something like surprise, as if he'd forgotten she was there. "Then we live with the consequences of the truth instead of the comfort of lies." He looked back at Marcus. "For 30 years you've been honored as the guardian of Britain's greatest secrets. Museums have been built around your service. Children have learned about the heroic defenders of democracy. None of them know they're celebrating a lie." Marcus opened his eyes, and Sarah saw something she'd never expected. Peace. The terrible tension that had defined him for weeks was dissolving, replaced by the exhausted relief of a man finally setting down an unbearable burden. "I've written it all down," Marcus said, moving to his desk drawer. He withdrew a thick envelope, sealed and addressed to the Morrison family. Every detail, every name, every order Churchill gave me that night. He held it out to Jonathan. "I finished it this afternoon." Jonathan stared at the envelope but didn't take it. "You knew I was coming." "I've known for weeks. Since the first photograph arrived, I've been waiting for this conversation." Marcus's voice grew stronger, more certain than Sarah had heard it in months. "I've been a coward for 30 years, hiding behind classifications and national security, but I won't let those families mourn lies anymore." Sarah watched Jonathan's composure finally crack completely. His hands shook as he reached for the envelope, and she saw tears in his eyes for the first time since he'd entered the room. "My grandfather," he whispered, "was the greatest man I ever knew, and the most terrible." "Churchill saved millions of lives," Marcus said gently. "That truth doesn't disappear because of what he did to 12 men, But those 12 men deserved to be remembered for who they really were. Jonathan clutched the envelope against his chest, the same gesture Marcus had made with the classified folder. The Morrison family will never forgive any of us. No, Marcus agreed. They shouldn't. But they'll understand that their grandfather died a hero, the kind of hero who put conscience above career, who risked everything to protect people he'd never meet. He looked at the blood-stained dagger on his desk. That's more than I've been for 30 years. As dawn approached above them, filtering down through the museum's ventilation system like hope through concrete, Marcus Whitfield finally understood what Jonathan Hartwell had spent 3 decades learning, that some truths were more important than the comfort they destroyed, and that real heroism sometimes meant accepting the consequences of honesty. The past had finally, irrevocably, collided with the present, and for the first time in 30 years, Marcus felt ready to face whatever came next.